So for the longest time, I found myself frustrated because I was always focusing on the result opposed to the things I could control. So the things we can control are the inputs. Those are things like the amount of doors we knock on, the amount of cold calls we make, the amount of people we follow up with, the amount of emails we send. Inputs are the things we put into the system to get the result, which is, for example, money. Money is an output. There's this amazing equation I learned from Alex Mosey, and that is inputs equal outputs. Once I discovered this, everything felt so much more doable. Now, the reason why focusing on the result can be frustrating is because when you set a very broad goal and you say, for example, I want to make 10 grand a month, you're doing the actions every day to make 10 grand a month, but you never know how close you are because you don't even know the amount of effort you need to put in, the amount of hours you need to work, the amount of calls you need to take, the amount of people you need to speak to get that amount of money. And that's why it can be very frustrating because there's really no form of progress. So personally, what I started doing, it's been a complete game changer, is instead of focusing on the big picture, taking things week by week. Now, the reason why I love setting weekly projections, I learned this from Cole Gordon, is because what you do is, you begin with the end in mind. I know it sounds so corny, but you start off with the month. You're like, okay, so this month, I want to take 100 sales calls, right? So I'm gonna have 100 sales calls on my calendar. That's what you start with, okay? Then from there, you break that down to the weekly basis. It's like, okay, so in order for me to hit my goal for the month, I have to hit 100 sales calls a month, which is the one thing I can control, the amount of inputs I put in. So starting with that in mind, I then take that to a weekly basis. So I need to take 25 calls a week in order to hit 100. And this from here is so powerful because what happens is you can catch yourself when you're not gonna hit your end goal by the end of the month because you'll be able to see where like this week I only took 17 calls. Okay, why did that happen? You can then diagnose the issue. And then from there, you then fix it right then and there. And then once you get down to next week, guess what? You hit your goal that week. You hit the 25 calls because you've diagnosed what the problem was. And that's why it's so important. Setting weekly goals, weekly projections is so important because it gives you a form of measurement and it keeps you accountable. Break it down to ridiculous. I do this on a daily basis. So it's like, okay, I work 5 days a week. I take 5 calls a day, right? Currently. So that means if every single day when I'm looking at my calendar and I'm doing my projection for the day, I can see, okay, did I hit the 5 calls a day? No, I didn't. Okay, that means tomorrow I need to take more calls. Or I need to work on a day I usually wouldn't work so I can hit the 25 calls by the end of the week to make the amount of money I want to make by the end of the month. And if I just focus on the inputs, I will hit the goal by the end of the month. Now, this is really a big thing, right? The biggest mistake that I've made myself when setting goals is, there's an amazing book by Grant Cardone called 10X. Long story short, it says, hey, take your goal, multiply that by 10, this is your new goal. So let's say you want to do 100 grand a month, let's say you want to do 100 grand a year, you're gonna have to do 1 million. That's gonna be your goal for the year. And the whole point is, when you set bigger targets, you start to think differently. And I do think that is very powerful in a sense, but also in the same breath, I also, from what's happened to me personally, is it basically just ending in the cycle of frustration because I'm like, I am not even remotely close to getting my goal, nor do I have the knowledge to do it. So for me, it was just really frustrating. So for some people, 10X goals are amazing, but for me, what worked a lot better was setting small micro goals. Because from there, I feel like every single day is a win. And when I'm winning more, it makes me want to work more, and when I'm working more, I'm making more money. Now, when it comes to hitting goals, there's something called a KPI. This is a key performance indicator. For example, a lot of people will set them, but this is the problem. When you're making your goals, you set it at your KPI. So let's just say, your close rate is 25%. That means whenever you talk to 4 people on the phone, like you actually are speaking to them, you're closing 1 person and they're signing paperwork and you then are getting paid. That's great. But personally, what I like is a projection is something that if you put in all the effort, you will still make X amount of dollars. So for example, even if your close rate is 25%, when I'm saying projections, I'm doing it like half of that. So my projection is actually 13%. That means even if I suck that month, I still will hit the target income. And the reason why I do this is because it makes it for me that even if I have the best month of my entire life, or if I have the worst month, I will still hit my goal. And when you hit that, you feel like you're winning. And when you feel like you're winning, it makes you want to do more. And also, kind of while we're on the topic of mistakes, another thing I see, and the thing I did myself, is when we focus on our inputs, we're like, okay, so if instead of taking 5 calls a day, let me just take 10. And then you then set this super unrealistic, input goal for yourself. And then what happens is you start to do it and you're like, well, I'm not actually doing this. I then would enter a pattern of never hitting my inputs, which then resulted in me seeing myself as a failure, which then resulted in me wanting to do the work less because there's this negative reinforcement. It's like, I know I need to do this, but I'm not doing it. So as cliche as it sounds, I think you'd be better off starting off slow and then starting to scale up. To put in this perspective, right? I'm starting with 5 calls a day, 5 days a week, just to get that consistency going, just so I can see myself hitting my projections every week, which is 25 calls. Now, once I do that consistently, once I hit 25 calls a week over a large sample size, we'll just say, 3 months, I then will start to scale up. So instead of taking 5 calls a day, I'll take 6, and then eventually 7, then 8, then 9, then 10. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because I'm increasing my work capacity, because with different kinds of work, they require different levels of focus. So for me, right now, it's very mentally demanding. So I'm just starting to easily start to slow and scale up more and more. So eventually I will be taking 10 calls a day. But until then, I will just be working my way up the ladder. And I know this stuff sounds crazy, but this is exactly what I did when I was in door-to-door sales. For the longest time, I was feeling completely discouraged. I'm like, oh my God, I just suck in my job. Till eventually I started tracking just my numbers. What happens is when I start to track my numbers, I start to know, well, if I do this amount of effort, I will get this amount of appointments. And if I get this amount of appointments, I will get X amount of deals. And when I started to do that, things just felt so much more natural. So what I highly encourage you to do is really begin with the end in mind. Start off with where do you want to be, and then from there, reverse engineer it. And then seriously, sit there and have an honest conversation with yourself. If you figure out that you're going to need 5 hours a day or 6 hours a day or 10 hours a day to get your goal, you got to honestly ask yourself, if I tell myself I'm going to do this, am I going to do it? If the answer is no, reduce that. Because this is what happens, guys. When you constantly tell yourself you're going to do things, but you don't do it, it results in you not trusting yourself. And when you don't trust yourself, you have less confidence, you have less conviction. And when you have less of that, you have less of everything.